bring this meeting to order. This is the 38th meeting of the Standing Committee on Defense, and we have with us today Professor Lajeunesse from St. Francis Xavier University and Dr. David Perry here physically from the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. Both of you are familiar with the procedures of the Defense Committee. So each of you have 5 minutes for your opening statement, and we'll start with Professor Lajeunesse.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here to take part in these important discussions. My research and expertise lie in the field of Arctic defense and policy, and it's in that area that I'd like to offer some comments. I can, however, answer questions on a broader array of northern security issues, including China's evolving role in the region, which I've written on extensively. To begin with, the February 2022 invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation has obviously upended Canada's understanding of global security and great power competition. The concern has naturally extended into the Arctic, where we are neighbors with Russia across the Arctic Ocean. Canada is naturally reconsidering its defense policy, and I suspect its Arctic policy as well, which has not had a clear policy refresh in over a decade. I'd like to offer some advice on better ways to frame our thinking on Arctic defense in this new geopolitical environment. Both Canada and the United States have long approached northern security with a sense of insecurity. This is apparent in the academic literature, in the media, and from many politicians, frankly. Russia, and even China increasingly, exist in our security paradigm as serious threats which outclass us in every respect. The Russian icebreaker fleet, its array of northern bases, and sophisticated air and sea defense spread across Siberia are constantly cited in the media and by politicians as a peril which threatens Canada, and with our own and even American assets in the north paling in comparison. So this narrative, which could have been written in Moscow, and in fact is one of the most common stories told by Russian state media and proxy news sites to highlight its own strength and Western weakness. The problem is that this narrative is rubbish. We're buying into it, and it's impacting our strategic thinking. So let me offer a different and I think more realistic framing for our policy. Russia is not strong or confident in the Arctic. It is terribly insecure and vulnerable. Russia has over 24,000 kilometers of Arctic coastline that it has to defend. And based on its recent national and service policies, it places a very high value on that defense. That makes sense. The Russian Arctic holds that country's future. That's where the largest and newest natural gas and oil deposits are, the development of which is existential to the future of the Russian state as it currently is constructed. The Russian Arctic is home to much of the country's strategic nuclear capability, vast mining operations, and a strategic sea route. Russia's northern military deployments are rooted not in confident visions of power projection, but rather in a terrible sense of insecurity, that these vulnerable resources and industries are at risk. And indeed, a quick look at what systems the Russians have deployed into the north shows that defensive mindset. The North American Arctic is not a strategic center of gravity. From a military and economic perspective, there is simply nothing there, which, if struck by the Russians, would cripple or do serious damage to Canada or the United States or our economies or ability to wage war. Canada and North America more broadly are not vulnerable to Russian attack in the Arctic. Russia is vulnerable, and the government in Moscow is well aware of that. To put it simply, Russia has very little capability to project power into the North American Arctic in a manner which would not be swiftly defeated or contained. NATO strikes against the Russian Arctic would be devastating. Highlighting Canadian weakness or NATO inferiority in the region is not only a misinterpretation, but it supports Russian narratives. Canadian policy should not exaggerate Russia's ability to project power across the Arctic or underestimate NATO forces in that same region. We might also look at Russian Arctic deployments from a different perspective in the future. The far north is a difficult and expensive place to deploy. It is also, for the most part, isolated. It may seem counterintuitive, but I would argue that Russian deployment of high-end military hardware into the north should be tacitly encouraged by Canada and its allies. The Russian defense budget is not infinite, and its stock of advanced precision-guided munitions is dwindling, as we know. It is in the West's interest that an insecure Russia is forced to place these assets in coastal Siberia rather than Ukraine or Western Russia close to our NATO allies. Messaging is therefore important. Canada must stop pretending that Russia dominates the Arctic. And if there is anything that we can do to exacerbate existing Russian insecurities over its own safety, those efforts may pay strategic dividends. Thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Professor Lajeunesse, Dr. Perry, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to speak to you today about Arctic security. So I would also place the discussion today against the backdrop of Russia's brutal war against Ukraine, which is demonstrating to me in a very real manner the implications of the return to great power competition that were identified in the 2017 Strong, Secure, Engaged Defense Policy. Both Russia and China continue to invest in military modernization programs, and they employ those modernized armed forces in concert with other elements of state power in ways that threaten Western and Canadian interests. Given both of those countries demonstrated and expressed interest in the Arctic, their increasing capability to take military action, either through the Arctic against targets in the rest of Canada or North America, or against targets in the Canadian Arctic itself. Canada needs to act with an urgency that we are not demonstrating yet to strengthen our Arctic defenses. The announcement this summer of a package of investments supporting NORAD modernization is a good start to bolstering our Arctic defenses, but we should look to build on those investments in defense infrastructure and aerospace assets by adding subsurface naval capabilities and integrated air and missile defenses to improve our ability to both understand what is happening in our coastal waters, but also be able to defend Canada against missile threats. However, unless substantial changes are made, we can expect that those investments could take between 2 and 3 decades before they actually produce operationally employable defense assets. Let me cite a few somewhat depressing examples to illustrate how glacial the pace of our Arctic defense investments have been recently. The Nanisivik Naval Refueling Station was launched as a government initiative in 2006, but after repeated delays, the last information I could find was that it is not yet slated to open until 2023. Of the 5 projects intended to renew the Canadian Armed Forces core equipment platforms and the 2008 Canada First Defence Strategy, 3 of them, the replacement of our frigates and destroyers, new fighter aircraft, and maritime patrol planes, would meaningfully improve our Arctic defenses. None of the 3 projects that I just cited have yet resulted in the delivery of a single plane or ship, and under current schedules, they won't until between 2025 and the mid-2030s. The observations I would make about our demonstrated very slow ability to improve Arctic defense capability relevant for the committee's study are twofold. First, we need to spend at least as much time and effort on improving our actual ability to implement the defense policies and funded investments that we have today as we do considering additional future plans and investments. And second, when taking decisions today about the future, we need to account for our actual ability to respond to possible future changes in our security environment in the decades to come, and not just our assessment of the world around us right now, given the time it takes to actually implement these types of decisions. With respect to my first observation, I'd encourage the committee to focus throughout its study on what the Government of Canada collectively is doing to improve our ability to actually deliver more Arctic-focused information management, information technology, infrastructure, and equipment investments. With respect to my second observation, I'd encourage the committee to think about the practical implications of how long it actually takes us to improve our Arctic defenses and the impact of that on how we should assess military threats to the Canadian Arctic. When people talk about potential military threats, they're generally assessing the probability that military capabilities that countries like Russia and China possess and how they could be employed to threaten Canada's Arctic, and assess whether or not they actually will be employed. In other words, they're evaluating a combination of military capabilities, which already exist right now, with the potential hostile intent to use them. And as we're watching today in Ukraine, autocratic great powers can and do use the military capabilities they develop with hostile intent when they deem it important, and do so in ways that many of us in the West have difficulty understanding. Since those great powers have already developed the military capability to threaten Canada's Arctic, and their intent to do so could change in a matter of days or weeks, The fact that it would take us decades to do anything about it should cause us some significant concern. We need to start acting with significantly increased urgency to improve our Arctic defenses today and start planning for the future on the assumption that the threats to our north are already real now and will worsen over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Perry. We seem to have a divergence of views, which is very helpful, actually. With that, we go to our 6-minute round. Mr. Kelly.
Thank you. Dr. Perry, I'd like to talk about lapsed funding. Public accounts show $2.5 billion in lapsed funding. You spoke of delay. Maybe explain and get on the record the effect of lapsed funding and how that impacts our ability to, well, in this case, to defend the Arctic.
Sure. So, lapsed funding effectively means that money that was allocated, that was drawn through the estimates, doesn't actually get spent on whatever it was intended to actually purchase. I'm not sure specifically, I haven't seen the explanation for exactly why the number last year amounted to $2.5 billion, but the net result of that is $2.5 billion that didn't go to whatever it was supposed to actually acquire and produce in terms of military capability.
Okay. So $2.5 billion was allocated, was approved by Parliament, allocated by through the estimates, and yet not spent. So we're not even spending the money that we've actually agreed to spend, let alone the additional commitments that would be necessary to adequately fulfill the requirements that you've outlined. Is that correct?
Yes, I'd say it's actually worse than that because there's also an additional amount over and above what Parliament actually allocated and what was approved through the estimates compared to the amount that was actually intended to be spent and set aside in the fiscal framework under strong, secure, and engaged. That additional amount is about $2 to $3 billion over and above the amount that was actually called for in the estimates and then lapsed. So the real delta between execution and the available funding is probably closer to $4 or $5 billion when you add the lapse that was actually in the estimates and then include the amount that wasn't actually even drawn on, but which could have been.
So the government announced money that was then not authorized by Parliament or included in the estimates, and the money that was allocated by Parliament has not been spent. That's correct. Okay, thank you. Let's talk about the, you spoke about the need for subsurface capability in the Arctic. What kind of priority would you place on, ascribe to replacing the Victoria-class submarines? How quickly does that need to happen? What is the current state of subsurface defense capability?
I'd start with the current state. I don't think is nearly as good as it should be. Our existing submarine fleet doesn't have nearly as many operational days at sea as I think are warranted, given the current circumstance. I think we need to broadly be looking at replacing those submarines with either new submarines themselves or a system of underwater vehicles that could be operated remotely, perhaps working in conjunction, as well as additional sensing capability to be able to detect other people's submarines that could be working in Canadian coastal waters and approaches.
Okay. Can you maybe carry on with the importance of that, like describe some of the threats that we're trying to deal with?
I think essentially without improving that significantly, we don't know who's in our waters. We might be able to get some of that information from some of our allies if they're there. But if we don't have our own submarines there, we don't actually have a good understanding of what's happening within our coastal waters. And given the modernization of the Russian forces in particular, they've got sophisticated new submarine capability, which I think can actually pose a significant threat to both Canada and wider North American interests.
Okay. Was the funding announced by Minister Anand for the modernization of NORAD sufficient?
I don't think it's sufficient in the sense that it basically is only restricted, as far as I understand it, to a set of infrastructure and aerospace investments. Doesn't include money for any of that naval capability that I just discussed. So in that sense, no.
Okay, so the current announced modernization of NORAD is not adequate to Canada's defense needs.
That would be my assessment, yes.
Okay, thank you. Just maybe back to the issue of lapsed funding. What needs to change in order that we don't have lapsed funding? And this is not the only department that has significant lapsed funding. It would be one thing if the government would say, in the name of economy, we have decided to not undertake something, that would be one thing. We could have an argument about whether that's wise or not in any particular policy area. But when Parliament has actually authorized an expenditure and the government can't get the money out the door and fulfill the objectives that it has stated, this has extraordinary implications for our own security in this area. Can you talk about the procurement process, or what are the problems that the government has with actually getting money that's been authorized by Parliament out the door to fulfill the needs that it is for which it was authorized?
So I'd say that the fact that this has been happening since the late 2000s indicates that there's a series of systemic issues in addition to some that are more localized in the last couple of years. The implications of the pandemic on supply chains, workforce issues, those would have some immediate effects, I would imagine, on the amount of money that lapsed in the last fiscal year specifically. But beyond that, we don't have enough capacity in our procurement system to move the money that's earmarked as fast as we want to. There's not enough people. They don't have enough specific preparation and training. Given the mismatch between capacity and intent, there's not enough prioritization, I don't think, on which projects need to move as a matter of priority. And I think there's also a need to have a better central focus from the entire government of Canada, from the cabinet level on down, to really drive this if it's an important priority for the government of Canada. There's a number of other things, but those are three that I'd focus on.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. May.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first of all, I want to thank both of the witnesses for being here today. We've been very lucky, I think, to get so many amazing witnesses on this study, and the chair said it earlier. Very divergent opinions. There doesn't seem to be a single clear path on a number of the issues regarding the North. My questions are going to be to Dr. Perry, and this may be one of those issues where we may hear different opinions. Earlier in this study, the Chief of the Defence Staff stated that policies related to ballistic missile defence are becoming less and less relevant, I believe was his quote, and that integrated air and missile defence is the concept of the future. Mr. Perry, would you like? I would like your thoughts on this. Do you agree? And can you elaborate on these concepts and provide any recommendations with respect to the missile defense?
Sure. So I guess I would say basically two broad things. We are facing a broader array of missile threats than we did 20 years ago. Ballistic missiles are one part of that, but advanced cruise missiles, hypersonics are additional evolving components of that. So to say that there's a specific need to focus on just one type of those, I think, is an incomplete answer at best, because it's a range of possible scenarios that we need to improve our defenses against. And to the integrated component of that, I think the way to think about that, and as we're seeing in some cases play out in Ukraine right now, the best defense is to have a layered, integrated set of systems that can defend against a range of those incoming missiles, rather than having individual disaggregated systems that have to look and identify and basically assess an individual type of incoming missile and then make a determination about whether or not that's something you want to be able to effectively shoot down. So a system that can deal with a broad array of those different missile threats in a way that is cohesive and integrated, that doesn't have to rely on distinct sets of pieces of technology being cobbled together, but it was designed to be integrated from the beginning, I think would be an ideal scenario.
Given our current situation, our current status with this, what would be the first couple of steps that Canada needs to take to get to that scenario?
I think we need to build off the investments committed to this summer and actually make some investments in additional sensing warning that could feed into those missile systems, as well as some actual mechanisms to potentially shoot down a missile if we wanted to. So as an example, we're building ships that I think are going to have a capability to play some role there, but it's not clear whether or not they're being designed in a way that would allow them to explicitly be integrated into a wider North American system of missile defense, which would include things that are being done both by the Missile Defense Agency in the United States as well as the United States Air Force and the United States Navy.
Given its history and of course geography, Canada has a range of military obligations. We've seen pressures involving multiple fronts, including Europe. Indo-Pacific, and of course the North, as well as aid to civil authority, which we just finished an entire study on. In your opinion, can Canada significantly contribute to the security in all of those areas, and how can it successfully balance its efforts?
So I'd say we absolutely can if we want to. We're a rich country, and if we would like to actually make the investments across a wide range of areas, then we could absolutely make very significant contributions in a number of those areas, and we already do today. I think the difficulty that we face right now is that our resource commitments and the ability to actually execute the resources that have been committed don't align with a broad array of those pressures, from the domestic responses that you touched on to the continental ones, as well as ones abroad. If we want to be able to try and, I think, keep pace and keep sort of a commensurate level of engagement that we have had historically even, we need to be looking to increase our ability to actually commit and spend more resources across a broad array of fronts. Fundamentally, though, if we can't commit those and spend those resources, then I think we're going to be making choices either by default or by design, and picking and choosing which of those areas we're going to focus efforts in.
Mr. Chair, how am I doing? A minute. Well, I think just given the amount of time that I have, I would just simply ask again, in that regard, when it comes to balancing those priorities, what should be the focus? What needs to be the priorities for Canada moving forward?
I think if we're in a situation where we need to make a decision, then we need to concentrate on our own country and our own backyard, and concentrate more on continental defense and in North American defense specifically, and then look abroad beyond that. But that's not how we've tended to approach those issues historically.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. May, Madame Normandy.
Merci.
Thank you very much. I thank both witnesses. I'd like to take advantage of the presence of Professor Lajeunesse, who's giving us a point of view that's very different from what we often hear at committee, and who mentioned that Russia considers itself at risk in the north. I'd be interested in knowing why Russia feels it's at risk. Who's the threat against Russia? I'd like to understand what's going on in the heads of this adversary.
Yes, absolutely. Russia has considered itself to be at risk in the north since the 1960s. This is nothing particularly new. And at first blush, it would make very little sense, I think, to most Westerners. The notion that there may be a NATO attack on Russia in the Arctic or elsewhere seems preposterous. And I would argue it is preposterous, but that is not always the way it is viewed in Russia. And you don't need to take my word for that or the word of any academic expert. You can simply look at what Russia is deploying into the north. Billions of dollars of high-end anti-shipping and anti-air defense weapons, most of which have a range which is fairly limited. These are not weapons which can reach out into the Arctic Ocean, much beyond the Russian coast. So by definition, these are defensive weapons. Now, it does make sense that Russia would feel slightly insecure about its Arctic. This is a region which produces a very good chunk of the Russian GDP. Most of Russia's hard currency earnings comes from oil and gas. A lot of that comes from the Arctic. And looking forward 20 or 30 years, we can see the future of Russian oil and gas production is going to be predominantly in the Arctic.
Peut-être en complément sur cette question-là.
Perhaps a follow-up. Does Russia consider China a threat?
The Russian-Chinese relationship in the Arctic, and very generally, is extremely complex. No is the short answer. Russia does not see China as a threat, or at least publicly, it does not see China as a threat. Predating Ukraine, and even more so post-invasion of Ukraine 2022, China has become Russia's only major consumer of oil and gas, and customer for a lot of Russian goods. And this is, of course, developing as Western sanctions continue to be applied. So looking forward, Russia recognizes that it needs China in many different ways as a source of technology and as a customer, a source of hard currency. And so Russia's role in China's role in Russian foreign policy is only going to increase. China's role in the Russian Arctic is also going to increase because many of these investments that we talked about, tens of billions of dollars, are required to build these oil and gas projects. It's not coming from the West anymore. It can really only come from China. And looking forward, that is going to be the linchpin of the Russian-Chinese relationship in the Arctic, is that investment in developing all of those new resource projects.
Merci beaucoup. Je continuerai.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go on with Professor Perry. My colleague, Mr. Kelly, talked about unused funds that are in a budget but are pointless. So regards to our GDP proportion of 2% for NORAD, for defense, is that calculated from budgeted funds or funds that are actually used, that contribution of 2%?
My understanding is that that's actually calculated based on what we actually spend, not what's committed.
Okay. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Now, when it comes to supplies or procurement, it's something you know well. We tend to misunderstand this here at the committee when it comes to procurement. It's often in another committee that they discuss this. I'd like to hear you about the fact that perhaps we should understand more what goes on with procurement at this committee, especially the impact it can have in the long term. I'm thinking of the parliamentary budget officer who mentioned that the costs with the Davy contract were going to explode because it's dragging on. I'd like to hear you about the importance for this committee to understand these issues better.
So I'd say a couple things. I mean, I would situate it within a wider program of public administration. I mean, the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces have a range of very serious personnel issues right now, both in terms of all the culture issues, but they have a massive quantitative problem right now, a huge recruiting and retention issue that needs urgent action. I would situate procurement within another kind of broader framework of public administration and implementation. We basically don't have a system that moves nearly as fast enough as we want it to and as fast as we've committed money. There are a range of different reasons for that, but I think systematically there hasn't been enough attention focused on calibrating the system to buy things as fast as we think that we need them. And there hasn't been a lot of evident improvement in that over the last 15 or 20 years. As I first started observing that the department was lapsing significant amounts of money on capital spending back in 2007, 2008. And that went away for a very brief period of time a few years ago. But there's now another problem of, as I was suggesting earlier, there's more money that's been allocated under the new accounting rules that's kind of over and above what gets drawn into the estimates, which still isn't going out the door. So various different ways that that's manifested from an accounting point of view. But the bottom line is we can't move money nearly as fast as we should be. And given the current situation with inflation, I think that that's becoming an increasingly severe problem. Defense inflation's always run, 6 to 7% higher than inflation in the civil sector. And now that inflation in the civil sector is at a multi-decade high, the Department of National Defense is, I would imagine, losing several tens of billions of dollars worth of purchasing power with the various delays in actually purchasing things on time.
Thank you, Ms. Normandine. David, as I recollect, you wrote your PhD on lapse funding. Can you just move up a little closer to the mic? Apparently your voice is draining off. 6 minutes, Ms. Matheson.
Thank you to both witnesses today. Professor Lajeunesse, I'd like to ask you, you wrote a policy paper that I'm actually hoping that you can submit to this committee as well, the Arctic Perils, Emerging Threats for the Arctic Maritime Environment, if that's okay.
Yes, happy to.
Great, thank you. Within that, you talk about much of what you've said today in terms of the Arctic presenting an enticing opportunity for China to feign strategic interest and bait Arctic states to overinvest or overcommit in capabilities to that region. You said that this is not this is misguided. This isn't what Canada should be focusing on. My concern is, of course, and I've expressed it before in this committee, that this would further escalate tensions in the region. Can you speak to that or expand on that?
My apologies. There's a bit of echo here. We're back to the echo. Could you repeat the very last part of that question?
Certainly, just in terms of that idea, that misguided idea of putting far more emphasis into the heavy investment in missile defense, and how that would escalate tensions in the Arctic.
Mm-hmm. So what I have long argued is that we need to look at Arctic defense in a much more nuanced way. And I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding to say that Dave Perry and I have a very different opinion on this. In fact, Arctic security, Arctic defense is very important, and we do need to make serious investments, but we need to zero in on what exactly the threat environment is. And what I have argued is that we are not seeing or likely to see a great power threat to the Arctic. Through the Arctic, yes, perhaps, and that is why we have NORAD modernization and those requirements for those investments. But what I'm arguing is that it would be a waste of money. It would be an inefficient use of our resources to build the Arctic defenses in such a way as to gear them towards Russia or China. It would be simply an inefficient use of very scarce resources.
And so a lot of the folks from the military we heard from General Eyre as well, in terms of that staying the course, going along those modernization lines, but not expanding greatly, looking at Russia as a longer term issue, and in the shorter term, focusing on what we can do to ensure that we're not, and I think that you spoke a little bit to this, so expand on this maybe as well, pushing that isolation of Russia further into maybe China's wheelhouse of financing and so on. That was more of where I think that conversation was leading. Could you expand as well?
I hope so. That is a problem that's certainly been identified. The more isolated Russia becomes from the West politically and financially, the further it is being pushed into Chinese arms. And we risk a scenario where Russia becomes, if it becomes weak enough, it actually becomes something of a satellite of China. It's difficult to see a way around that, however. The West is not going to open up financing again to Russia, barring some significant break in Russian behavior and change of behavior. The West is not going to re-engage with Russia politically to the point where Russia will disengage more with China. So that is a problem that we acknowledge, that is recognized. We do not want to drive Russia and China closer together, but there's not an obvious avenue of approach to prevent that from happening. Over the long run, what might prevent Russia from falling too deeply into the Chinese camp is the persistent and remaining suspicion within Russia itself of China. Russia does not want to become a satellite of China. Both the Russian government and the Russian people, I suspect, are going to think very poorly of that relationship developing in that way. But that's conjecture at this point. I'm afraid I have no obvious answer.
Okay. In a previous meeting, we heard from Professor Lockenbauer, and he was specifically talking about our need to think about the Arctic in, through, and to, and the threats there in that sort of set. So you spoke about the through, but in terms of the threats in the Arctic, a lot of our conversations have been around the climate change, the lack of infrastructure. Are you able to expand in terms of whether Canada would even have, in an infrastructure sense, the capacity to expand in this idea of weaponry versus going along that sort of status quo of modernization, and the difference?
Very briefly, please.
Yes, Canada does face serious in the Arctic threats, predominantly non-conventional threats. So what we're talking about is illegal fishing, pollution prevention, trespassing, and some of those may be non-state actors, some of them may be state actors. Chinese scientific research, for instance, is a serious concern, developing dual-use technologies. For those threats, we are developing the right capabilities, the Arctic offshore patrol ships, surveillance, and as Dr. Perry mentioned, we need that increased situational awareness as well.
Ms. Matheson. Colleagues, we again are in a situation where we have 25 minutes worth of questions and a lot less time. I'm proposing that we do a full round of questions at this hour, because the next hour will only be one witness, and so we may be a little bit more efficient. So we'll go a full 5 minutes. We'll do full 5 minute rounds, and that'll probably take us past the 12 o'clock point. But if that's all right with everyone, Ms. Gallant, 5 minutes.
Dr. Perry, will the $3 billion Minister Anand announced be enough to modernize NORAD and the North Warning System to the capabilities required now and into the future?
So I think it's hard to say without knowing how fast that money can actually be spent. I think on a cash basis, it's more like $87 billion is what the D&D CFO said at a conference we hosted last week. But part of that depends on how quickly the money can get out the door.
With respect to funding for subsurface surveillance, be it submarines or drones, given that we don't have the capability to get our surface ships built, let alone in the water, should we be consider buying subs and drones from an ally with a demonstrated ability to complete the project on time and on budget?
I think we should very seriously look at that. I think my understanding is that would basically require a government to take a policy exception to the current policy around acquiring Canadian ships in Canada, which I believe would include submarines. But given the additional technical complexity of building submarines versus just surface ships, which we've struggled with quite significantly, I think we should quite seriously look at the potential for taking a purchase like that offshore and weigh the pros and cons.
Okay, and we haven't put an order in or made a contract with any country in Canada?
No.
Okay, so how vulnerable would our low Earth orbit satellites be to given the capability of countries that do pose a threat?
That's beyond my own particular area of expertise.
Okay, so I thought that we mentioned low Earth orbit satellites with respect to the whole North Warning System. Do we know whether or not they could be shot down?
I think that's a potential risk, but it's not something that I have particular expertise in.
Okay, President Xi has pledged to make the PRC the country with the largest ice-breaking fleet in the world. Are Canada's current plans for the Arctic security sufficient to counter potential Chinese aggression in the future?
I don't think they are at present. I think part of that is actually fielding a fleet of new icebreakers. It's taken a very long time to not actually yet be at the point where we've got a contract in place to replace new icebreakers. I would hope to see that move a lot faster from this point forward than it has to this point, as well as the new Canadian Coast Guard icebreaking fleet being able to work more in a more integrated fashion with the Canadian Navy going forward.
Okay, so what do you make of President Putin's call yesterday to modernizing Russia's military weapons? Is that saber rattling, or is it something we should be concerned about?
I would say that the previous calls over the last 10 or 20 years to modernize Russian military capability actually resulted in modernized Russian military capability, so I would not take it as saber rattling if he's talking about either conventional or nuclear forces. They put a lot of money into those investments and delivered them.
How important are the F-35s to the security of our nation, and in particularly our responsibilities to NORAD?
I think they're incredibly important and long overdue.
Long overdue. And given our shortage of pilots, are you concerned that the delay in the F-35 procurements really is of consequence, since we at present don't have the people to fly them?
I think both of those issues, both the planes and the people to fly them, are very serious problems, and I would like to see more action more swiftly on fixing both of those issues.
Okay. Are there any other maritime capabilities we need that haven't already been covered in this meeting with respect to Arctic sovereignty that we should be talking about?
I think underwater sensors would be an area that I think we should focus on. So likely acoustical devices, but basically something you can put in the water at a place where you want to listen. That's a key piece of real estate, to have an idea of who's basically operating there, even if you don't have your own ship or submarine in place.
And are there any different types of vessels that are not part of the SSE that we should be looking at in addition to the submarines and the drones you mentioned?
I think there's probably, within a wider kind of network of sensors, there'd be additional investments there, both for maritime assets in particular, but beyond that, an integrated air and missile defense that would be able to cover a broad range of potential launch mechanisms. So basically, we have some assets that could deal with some threats at sea with our new ships, prospectively. We're going to have some ability to be able to deal with cruise missiles with F-35s once we acquire them. We don't have a well-defined integrated system to deal with a broad array of different missile threats.
Thank you.
And Madame Lambropoulos, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses for being with us this morning to answer our questions. I too was listening in and heard the divergence in opinion of the two witnesses, but also in this study, I feel that many different people have different views. So it's really interesting to learn about the different perspectives that exist on this issue. And my first question will go to Mr. Lajeunesse. You mentioned that the Arctic is not necessarily under threat by Russia, and it won't be. You don't see a potential threat to our Arctic in the near future. However, at the same time, you did mention that for Russia's Arctic is something that they value very much. A lot of their resources come from this area, and so economically, it definitely is an area they focus on. And then you also referred to the fact that if we did invest in our Arctic and we did improve our military capability in that region, it would perhaps force the Russians to shift their focus to their Arctic as well, because they may feel, I guess, under threat. Can you elaborate a little bit more on this and explain a little bit more where you're coming from? Because other witnesses that we've heard from in previous panels have really talked about the capabilities, the military capabilities of Russia to attack our our Arctic, either through air or underwater. So if you can just elaborate a little bit and clear up your perspective a little. Thanks.
Of course. To begin with, what I've advocated is not necessarily an increase in military capability in the Canadian Arctic in order to create this threat for Russia. What I suggested is in future policy statements and the way we comport ourselves, the way politicians speak, and the way we announce our intentions in the Arctic, we at least keep in mind that Russian insecurity, and we perhaps stop acting as though the Canadian Arctic is quite so in quite so much peril. When we talk about that peril, when we talk about the danger that Russia poses to our Arctic, I would always ask someone who says that it is in danger to game that out and to move one step beyond and say, well, what exactly is that danger? So what exactly is a Russian submarine going to do in the Canadian Arctic? Quite frankly, there's nothing of strategic value for that Russian submarine to attack. What exactly is a Russian airborne company going to do in the Canadian Arctic? There's not a whole lot for it to do. When we talk about Arctic security, you really need to separate the different Arctics. The Russian threat to the Arctic is in Scandinavia. It's in the Barents Sea. It's much closer to home. That's always been the case. There isn't a strategic threat from Russia to the Canadian Arctic, unless you're talking about a through threat, as Dr. Lachenbauer said, those threats which simply go through the Arctic towards the rest of North America. And in that case, it's not an Arctic threat per se, it's a global threat.
Okay. Do you still believe that there should be investments made in the Arctic? And I guess should our military capabilities be improved in this area, and what are the benefits of doing so?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned very briefly, there are still very serious threats to the Arctic. We just need to be clear-eyed about what they are. We're not talking about submarines and paratroopers per se. What we're most likely going to look at over the next 10, 20, 30 years in terms of threats are hybrid or unconventional threats. Chinese fishing fleets, trespassing, illegal shipping, poaching. Just last year, we had a Chinese adventurer coming through on a sailboat. This is a man supported by Chinese state media who has a history of personal freedom of navigation voyages. Now, the political ramifications of him moving through without our permission could have been very significant. He was only stopped by the ice. So those kinds of hybrid safety and security threats are going to be very real, and they're going to increase as more activity moves north and as more fish move north. And we are going to need more capabilities, situational awareness. We are going to need constabulary and naval capabilities like the AOPS, like new Coast Guards to manage these threats.
Thank you, Madame Lavropoulos. 2.5 minutes, Madame Normine.
Merci beaucoup, professeur.
Thank you. Once again, Professor Perry, I'd like to hear you about the politicization of procurement, the F-35s in particular. In early 2015, we said everything except the F-35. Then they said, yes, we want the F-35s. I'm thinking of the criteria that are applied in the field. We're told it's quite disconnected from needs. We know that in some ridings there are defense industries that receive more or less contracts depending on election result. Is this too politicized?
In my opinion, I think the question of politicization is vastly overstated. I think there's absolutely been a few key programs where there have been negative political involvement in a way that slowed down the process of actually acquiring something. But if you look at across the whole basket of hundreds of different projects that national defense is trying to advance, I would imagine that most of the members on this committee couldn't name 90% of them. I don't know that I could name more than 50 or 60 if you forced me to do it. So across the board, I don't think that I think the impacts of politicization are vastly overstated. They've been very important and key on a couple of different projects. But I personally think that there tends to be a lot more consensus around these things than we tend to think. I just don't know that there's been enough consensus to collectively act to buy these things faster than we have been in recent decades.
Merci.
Thank you. And on that point, our exterior resources that are more neutral, such as the Parliamentary Budget Officer, be a better choice? Would that be better when it comes to addressing different parties because they're perhaps more listened to?
I'm not sure that I caught the entire translation, but I think that the other the bodies of Parliament, like the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer and the Auditor General of Canada, play a critical function. And I think it's a good and needed thing that they are conducting regular studies on some of these big files. I don't know that the folks at National Defence always appreciate the extra scrutiny, but as an example, the Canadian Surface Combatant Project is the single most expensive thing the Government of Canada is attempting to do, as far as I can tell. So I think it's entirely reasonable to review the budget and the costing for that every year or two.
Merci.
Ms. Madison, a very generous 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Professor Lajeunesse, at the end of the last round I had, you were talking about the further investment or the welcomed investment in terms of the Arctic offshore patrol ships. In terms of, we've heard before from committee witnesses that that increase in traffic, the increase in potential commercial tourism with the opening of the Arctic is one of the issues certainly that the Arctic will have to deal with. Could you comment maybe in terms of that investments in our Coast Guard, and whether or not, when we think about the policing of that, if we have what's adequate, as opposed to the militarization of it, but the policing and international laws in that regard?
Well, what is unique about the Arctic and offshore patrol vessels is they are not warships per se. They're not frontline combatants. They were designed from the very beginning to be very versatile ships with an understanding that in the Arctic, the Navy is not going to be the lead actor. It's going to be a supporting actor. And so what the AOPS bring to the table is a platform that can move around fisheries and oceans personnel, RCMP, Transport Canada, border services agents. These are large, capable, versatile ships that can serve as platforms for other government departments to do their jobs. At the same time, they serve as sort of our eyes and ears on the Arctic waters. They are able to access pretty much any area where any other ship, apart from heavy icebreakers, can go. And as that activity you mentioned increases, the need for more situational awareness, the need to have more capability to respond in the event of emergency is going to increase. So they are a good solution married up with increased aerial surveillance, satellite surveillance, and potentially down the road subsurface surveillance as well.
Thank you, Ms. Matheson. Ms. Cramp-Newman, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Several different questions, different directions. I'm going to start with Professor Perry. With regards to submarines and deterrence and protecting our northern approach, could you speak a little bit more on that with regards to, you mentioned earlier, if we don't have submarines, then we don't know who are in our waters. So if you could just elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure, and I'd use the opportunity to disagree with Dr. Lajeunesse a little bit about what they maybe could do. In our own north, we have a signals intelligence facility at Alert. We have a radar installation which provides the early warning for continental North America about inbound air threats through the North Warning System. And we have several forward operating locations for our fighter aircraft. Every one of those locations is a potential military target for any particular type of missile that could be fired against a target on land. The Russians have advanced cruise missiles that can be deployed from either planes, surface ships, or submarines. So a submarine could be in our waters doing various things. Amongst the things that it could do would be to try and strike one of those particular military installations.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. And next, we recognize that threats are real and worsen over time. You noted that earlier. So with regards to upgrades for our NORAD, North Warning System, we know that it's a shared effort between Canada and the U.S. 60-40. So my question is, what are some of the factors that you see that would go into the funding formula negotiations, and does it help Canada's position when we are seen as a laggard on defense? And noted earlier, we have the lapsed billions in spending. We're experiencing a personnel crisis, and we're failing to pull our weight in NATO and NORAD. So going back to the question, what are some of the factors that you see that could go into the funding formula?
Okay, there's a lot in that. So I'd say, from my understanding, that's been a historical cost share, but it's not actually being considered today. My understanding is the announcement this summer of upwards of $80 billion is all Canadian money. I'm not actually clear about exactly what in the American DoD investment space maps against that, so you could come up with some kind of ratio for what Canada versus the Americans are doing. I do think, and hopefully I was trying to enumerate earlier, that there's lots of great Canadian-specific reasons for wanting to invest more in the defense of our country, our North, individually as a country and in the context of North America. But I definitely think that there's an increasing allied focus on this, where our allies want to see us actually be able to at least defend our own backyard better. And in a North American context, do so with our American allies. So I do think that there's an imperative for us to not just commit this money, but actually spend it and get out the door. And I think you could point to various comments that have been made by the American ambassador to Canada that they are actually looking to see what we can actually spend and buy, not just commit.
Perfect. Okay, and my last question, I'm good for time? Yeah, you've got 2 minutes. Beautiful. So with regards to the F-35s, we know that we're in desperate need of modern fighter jets to contribute meaningfully to the NORAD defense. So after years of dragging out the competition, the government finally selected the F-35s, but the contract still hasn't been signed. So we've heard from the commander of the Air Force that the RCAF added just one fighter pilot since 2020. So the numbers show the personnel crisis extends to fighter pilots and maintainers. So we're almost certainly lacking experienced fighter pilots to fly the F-35s if and when we finally get them. It puts us at a serious disadvantage, in my opinion, in NORAD defense. So from your viewpoint, your perspective, what is it going to take to reconstitute our fighter jet personnel when we have pilots leaving for the private sector after receiving several years of expensive training?
So first, I'd say that the fact that if the commander of the Air Force said they only got one additional pilot in the last 2 years, I mean, that to me indicates that there's an existential crisis if you can only get one pilot in at a time when the commercial aviation sector experienced the worst collapse in its entire existence. I'm not sure how much more conducive an environment you could get to actually getting new people in to fly military airplanes. I think at this point, the situation, not just on pilots, but across the board with personnel at National Defense, is of such a crisis level that you need to rethink everything. The current intake times, I understand, between showing up at a recruiting center and actually getting a job is months north of a year, which is an insane time frame given the current labor market. I think there's a whole number of components, both with the recruiting and initial training, as well as on the retention front, that need to be fundamentally rethought because the system we have right now is not fit for purpose.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Fisher, final five.
Thank you very much. And Dr. La Jeunesse, I want to ask you a question about a paper that you co-wrote. But before I do, I just want to, we talked a lot today about conflicting testimony, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I just want to get a little clarity on, you mentioned that Canada and NATO countries are not so vulnerable in the Arctic, that it's actually Russia that is vulnerable, and that anyone who is saying that Canada is vulnerable in the Arctic is playing into Russian narratives. Can you clarify if that's what you meant, what you said, and maybe a little elaboration on your thoughts on those comments? And I apologize if I didn't get them word for word.
Oh, absolutely, and it is a different way of framing the issue. To begin with, Russia's vulnerability stems primarily from what it has in the Arctic. Unlike North America, Russia's economy is very closely tied to assets that are located in the Arctic, and this goes back generations, which is where that Russian insecurity stems. The fact that they have a lot of very valuable, very vulnerable assets in the north. That's where that insecurity comes from. And the reason I'm saying North America is not as vulnerable is because, simply put, there is no strategic center of gravity in the North American Arctic. As Dr. Perry mentioned, there are several important targets in the Arctic, but their removal or their destruction would not fundamentally alter the Canadian economy or our ability to make war. NATO's strength in the Arctic is also very commonly downplayed or underestimated. NATO submarine fleets, which are the main vehicle for projecting power in the Arctic waters, are significant, large, they are technologically advanced, they're well trained. The Americans and the Brits never stopped going under the Arctic ice during the 1990s and the 2000s. So that capability is very real. NATO's aerospace power projection in the north is also obviously very, very significant. And as Finland and Sweden join the alliance, NATO's capability in the north, to my mind, will significantly outshine Russia's. Another element we can't ignore is the fact over the last 20 years, our assessment of Russian capability in the Arctic has been based on paper strength, what the Russians say they have, what we've seen there. As we've seen in the Ukraine, so much of that paper strength is just, it's not there. The Russian army, the Russian Air Force have been nowhere near as effective as we always expected that they would be. So I question why we put so much stock in the Russian state narratives, which holds up their Arctic power as this considerable dominating force, when every other element of their military has been shown to be something of a Potemkin village. I would just say we keep that in mind when we talk about the Arctic.
Thank you very much, Doctor, and certainly very, very conflicting. So I find it fascinating. So back to the article that you co-wrote, Why China is Not a Peer Competitor in the Arctic, which you wrote with Ryan Dean and a previous witness, Dr. Lachenbauer. You write, and I'm going to quote, Arctic states rebuffed what Western commentators saw as an initial Chinese push to internationalize the circumpolar North in the late 2000. So given the evolving relationship between Russia and China right now, how do you think that they would cooperate or conflict on matters relating to the Arctic?
Well, I think that there is not a single framework that we can talk about. I think that's going to be a case-by-case basis, whether it's governance, whether it's economic development. Russia does not want China further ingrained in Arctic governance. It has never wanted that, and it's going to continue to push back. What Russia wants is a case-by-case bilateral investment arrangement whereby China funds Russian resource projects. So that is where Russia wants increased Chinese engagement, not in broader questions of governance or rules making.
That brings our second round of questioning to a close, and I, on behalf of the committee, want to thank both of you for engaging, because this has been actually quite a stimulating back and forth, and I think informs us for this study in a way that we should be informed, namely that there are not monolithic opinions about how we should be dealing with our North. So with that, I'm going to suspend for a moment or two while we invite our current guests to leave and empanel our next guests. So with that, we're suspended. we have with us Brigadier General Dennis Boucher, Director General, Defense Security, and I have an unwelcome call about duct cleaning as we speak. Yeah, I think I should put them on. Yeah, that's what my brother says. He says, I don't have problems with ducks, I have problems with geese. So, anyway, this is a great way to introduce you, General Boucher. With that, we'll look forward to your 5-minute statement, hopefully, which will not involve either ducks or geese. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you today. I completely understand that call. I get the duck cleaning advertisement on a regular basis, so you're not the only one. And I would be happy to speak about geese when we talk about hunting on a weekend, but that's not for today. Sir, members of the panel, my name is Brigadier General Denis Boucher. I am the Director General of Defense Security and the Chief Security Officer for the Canadian Armed Forces and the Department of National Defense. I have several responsibilities. I was appointed as the Chief Security Officer by the Deputy Minister and the Chief of the Defense Staff, and as such, I am responsible for ensuring the security of the information, assets, and members of the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces. As the Director General Defense Security, I exercise overall responsibility for the leadership, development, and management of the Defense Security Program, and I am accountable through the Vice Chief of Defense Staff to the Deputy Minister and the Chief of Defense Staff for the integrated management of the Defense Security Program. Le programme de sécurité de la défense.
The Defense Security Program includes elements of security governance, planning, management of security risks, oversight and compliance, performance measurement and evaluation, and integration with other government departments as pertains to the security program. As part of the program, we have policies and directives internal to national defense that are derived from Treasury Board guidance, and these policies govern our program. They cover the 8 mandatory controls that are represented in the Treasury Board directives on security management. Thank you again, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to address this committee, and I would be happy to take any questions you might have.
We'll turn to Mr. Bazan for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, General Boucher, for joining us today. We invited you here to discuss the story coming out of the UK that Canadian fighter pilots that have retired are being employed by a South African company, which is directly training pilots from the People's Liberation Army in Beijing. Can you speak to that story and what steps are being taken by your staff in investigating that possibility?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. What I can say is that we are aware of the allegations, and obviously this matter is very concerning to us because we take all matters with regards to security very seriously. What I can say is that we're aware of the allegations, but we know that these are post-employment activities. So these members were former members of the Canadian Forces, and so they don't fall in the jurisdiction of the Canadian Armed Forces.
Confirm that there are Canadian trainers who are former RCF fighter pilots working as allegations have pertained.
So what I can confirm is that I have read media reports to that effect. I am not privy to any specifics over who the individuals are and confirming those details with regards to the company. I'm not aware of the company in question, but we are aware of these allegations, and we have referred the matter to our federal partners, and we'll make sure that they receive the support that they would require should they wish to investigate these matters further.
Okay. With respect to retired fighter pilots and other personnel within the Canadian Armed Forces, you mentioned provisions under the National Defense Act. Are they also bound by the Security of Information Act?
So yes, thanks for the question. Members of the Canadian Armed Forces, while in service, are obviously bound by the National Defence Act as well as the Security of Information Act. In retirement, they are still bound by the provisions of the Security of Information Act. However, jurisdiction over that falls to our federal partners. The Canadian Forces and the Department of National Defence no longer have jurisdiction over retired members.
So, do people of that level of training and know-how in warfare fighting and the tactics that we employ as Canadians and as a member of NORAD and NATO, do they ever sign non-disclosure agreements?
So while in service, when you're granted a security clearance, there are absolutely forms that they sign with regards to their acknowledging the responsibilities with regards to the Security of Information Act and the possible repercussions of any issue that could occur or any disclosure of that kind of information that would be not authorized. So they have to acknowledge those responsibilities under the Security of Information Act when they are granted a security clearance, and prior to release, they do have to sign a disclosure form again that reminds them of their obligations under the Security of Information Act. And that is the last time that we would have any jurisdiction over them.
Any former member of the Canadian Armed Forces that had that level of security clearance signed those non-disclosure agreements, but then went out and trained forces of our adversaries, would you, in your mind, see that as a breach of both their obligations under legislation as well as under legal documents like non-disclosure agreements?
So I think it's a bit of a speculative question. I don't know the details with regards to the type of employment that these members may have had. Again, these are allegations. I haven't seen anything specific with regards to that. If there is anything that would come to light that they would have disclosed any classified information, and again, that falls to our federal partners to investigate and follow up on. But it's very difficult to know what kind of information they could have shared, and it would be totally speculative on my part.
Okay. Do you believe that fighter pilots that we have currently serving and those that formerly served are targets by malign foreign actors as individuals they try to hire away? Money talks in a lot of cases to advance their own interests.
So again, this would be a bit of a speculative question from my perspective. It definitely does not fall within the purview of my office. A speculation, I would have to speculate on whether or not it would be of interest. I would think any former military member could potentially be of interest, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people will be hired. We trust our members, the Canadian Forces, certainly while they're serving and their obligations. And one would like to think that when they actually retire, some of that loyalty remains with them. As a 34-year member of the Canadian Forces, I can tell you that once I do retire, I'm not about to turn my back on Canada for money. So I would like to think that a lot of our members would do the same thing.
So you talk about federal partners for investigating those that may have been lured away, as we've seen in the media reports. Who are those federal partners, and what type of role do you think they're taking if these individuals are located out of country?
So the federal partners, so I don't necessarily speak with the federal partners personally based on my role, but the federal partners that we are in contact with would be Department of Justice, and they would have to look at the investigation, presumably from the RCMP perspective, and that's where we would be going. But that's all I can speak to on this point.
6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witness for being here, listening very closely to MP Bazan's questions. And I think this is going to get real repetitive really quickly, but I do have a few maybe more elaborative questions here to allow you to kind of speak in more detail to some of these questions. Can you speak to how the Security of Information Act, the National Defence Act, and the Code of Service Discipline apply to members of the armed forces in terms of the security of information?
So thank you for the question. That's a fairly broad question. I will not try to delve into the detail of the legal aspects of the legislation that governs our protection of this information. What I can tell you is, as we have members that are recruited into the Canadian Forces, we go through a reliability screening as the first element of their recruiting. So then that does a background check. We do things like credit checks, criminal record checks, and the like. And as we move through, depending on the type of employment they will have and the requirements for security clearances, then we do also a security clearance verification, which delves further into their background, and we'll start looking into elements such as loyalty. That's how we actually screen our members, and that's how we end up giving them security clearances over time. And those security clearances can evolve throughout the duration of their career based on the needs of their employment. That falls within my purview as the Director General of Defense Security. We look at all personnel security issues. So application of those acts and the obligations of members are understood by those members as they have to sign that disclosure agreement, as was mentioned earlier.
So, again, what obligations do those members? What obligations carry over after a member of CAF is released, and how is compliance monitored following release? Is compliance monitored following release?
So thanks for the question. The obligations under the Security of Information Act do carry over after release. You are not allowed to disclose classified information to anyone who would not have been authorized to be in possession of that information. This being said, they are no longer within the jurisdiction of the Canadian Armed Forces. And so we, the Canadian Forces, cannot follow up or investigate on those members. As allegations come to light, then obviously we are concerned. We do look into these things, but with our federal partners.
You mentioned in your opening remarks that the Defense Security Program includes elements of security governance, planning, management of security risks, and the integration with other government departments. Can you just spend some time to elaborate on how the Canadian Armed Forces and D&D specifically work with those other government departments to manage security risk, particularly with respect to the security of information?
Certainly, thank you. As the Director General of Defense Security and the Chief Security Officer, I am in regular contact with Chief Security Officers of other government departments as well. And that's every government department has a CSO that is designated. And we're all responsible largely for similar types of responsibilities internal to our own government departments. Some departments are much larger than others, such as defense. We share information with regards to personnel security screening, because members of the public service can transfer departments, members of the Canadian Armed Forces can leave the forces and be hired as public servants elsewhere. We'll exchange information there. We're integrated with the RCMP, for example, from a criminal records check perspective. We certainly exchange information as required there. Those kinds of things would be areas. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. Mr. Chair, how much are we looking at? A minute or so?
Yeah,
minute and a half. You talked a little bit about the federal partners that you're working with, that you would work with in this scenario, and I think you mentioned justice. For the record, the Department of National Defense would not be the agency conducting any of these investigations. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that is correct. Members of the Canadian Forces are only under the jurisdiction of the Canadian Forces and the Department of National Defense until such time as they retire. Once they retire, they're Canadian citizens, civilians, much as any other Canadian citizen would be, and that is no longer under the jurisdiction of the Canadian Armed Forces. The only exception that could potentially happen is if somebody had caused an offense or had been investigated for and is charged with an offense from a time from when they were in uniform. So you're responsible for as long as you are in uniform. Post-retirement, any activity that would have taken place before you retired, you could potentially be investigated for, and there would be room there. But in this case, I would suggest, based on these allegations, these are members who retired and who were sought for employment after the fact. That would not have been something internal to defense, and we would not have jurisdiction.
Thank you, Mr. May. Madame Normandine, 6 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you very much, Brigadier General, for your presence here. I'd like to carry on Mr. May's question. You mentioned it's because these pilots were retired and you don't have jurisdiction over them, but they did have information that they obtained during the time where they were military personnel. So I have a lot of questions. I'll ask them one after the other. It's CSIS and the RCMP that are in charge of this investigation, but doesn't that prevent us from seeing what the risks are? The fact that these pilots may have transmitted information to Chinese authorities, their military knowledge. Wouldn't it have been a good idea to include defense to better understand what the potential threat is here, not just to look for the guilty parties? Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I understand your question correctly, yes, jurisdiction is these two agencies leading the investigation. Of course, they will take advantage of our knowledge too. That's why we cooperate with them. We are not leading the investigation. If our partners need information from us, we will collaborate with them. The Department of National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces take security very seriously. We're worried, of course, about the security of our members and our responsibilities when it comes to Canada's defence. So we're prepared to collaborate with our federal partners and other departments in order to figure out the risk to our information, to our members, and to our national defense. Now, having said that, a pilot will have been trained on many different things. Some things will be more sensitive, some far less, and I suggest for the time being that learning to fly is not necessarily a sensitive matter. It's what tactics they will use that could become difficult. I'm not a pilot, so it's speculation on my part, but we're talking about many different issues here. Well, precisely that. When it comes to those tactics, is there a risk? Or at least are you assessing that there may be a risk? There may be Canadian military strategies, but also NATO military strategies that could have been transferred to Chinese pilots. I would say that there's always the possibility of a risk. Indeed, our pilots work with other NATO countries, with our allies, be it with a Canadian unit or with other allies. And of course, we share the concerns of our allies when it comes to these allegations. Is there a possibility that we should share information? Yes, that's always possible. There could be a transfer of information on tactics, and that's often freely available on the internet. So I'd say yes, it is a possibility. It could be a risk of information being disclosed, but having said that, any former member of the Canadian Armed Forces must comply with their obligations under the Security of Information Act. There's a potential for investigation, and there is jurisdiction over certain measures. You mentioned pilots. Yes, they have information on how to fly a plane, but they certainly have higher level information too. They know standardized procedures, for instance. There are newspaper articles that said this could be a gold mine for Chinese pilots. I'd like to hear your views on that. Is there any information that could be very relevant to Chinese pilots? Thank you. From my standpoint, I'm sorry, I had an echo here. From my standpoint, and this is an opinion, speculation on my part, I'm no expert on this area. My area of expertise right now is management of the defense security program. What I can tell you is, yes, there's certainly information that could be relevant elsewhere, but having said that, we trust our members, and we want to trust retirees too, and we hope they will maintain their obligations under the Information Protection Act. So what we want to see, of course, is that they have protected the information. The investigation that will come under jurisdiction of our federal partners will help uncover what they may have shared at that point. Thank you very much. You mentioned that there's information already available online on the internet, but there are military manuals, for instance, that are given to military personnel, BGLs, for instance. To your knowledge, is this information that the Russians or Chinese already have in their hands, other than through these pilots? That kind of strategic information? Thank you. That would only be speculation on my part, but there are many documents that you've mentioned, such as these BGLs, that talk about military doctrine and tactics, but that's for the land army. There are some that are available online already. But when you leave the Canadian Forces and you make a statement about your obligations under the legislation, we also give any documents or information that may be sensitive or classified. We have to indicate on the form that we have given back all information that we had in our possession. The information that is classified is not information we would have in our homes. It's only in work environments that we'd have that when it comes to published documents. Thank you, Ms. Normandin.
Madison, 6 minutes.
Thank you so much, Brigadier General, for appearing today. I'm hoping that you can provide a bit more context. You already spoke about the variety of Canadian acts and laws that are supposed to provide that protection in terms of military information sharing from retired forces. Can you compare that to what the UK has in place?
So I am not. I have to get used to this echo whenever we start up. Thank you for the question. I'm not aware of all of the policies that the UK or the US would have in place. We are in regular contact and we do compare policies and procedures with our allied partners because it is best practice to do so and constantly revise our practices. So we do have a number of policies in place. The UK do have a number of policies in place for protection of information that I am aware of. I am not aware of the detail there. I'm sorry.
Is there a comparison? Because ultimately a lot of what has been verified is that there are UK pilots that are involved with this company. Is there any way to compare that in terms of that legal obligation after military service?
So I would say there are ways that their obligations could be compared, but I think that becomes a question that is a bit outside of my purview, my area of expertise. When we're starting to talk about the actual detail, the legal detail of the Security of Information Act, which is a legislative document, I would tend to want to refer that to legal authorities. I certainly am far from a legal authority myself, but I suspect that their policies and their laws governing the secrecy of information for them or security of information for them would be very similar to ours. We tend to protect information along the same lines, and that's why we're in such close partnerships with those countries in particular.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. If I could just shift a bit in terms of, there's been a suggestion, of course, that a lot of this is about money and the seeking of very advantageous contracts. Do you think that and I guess this falls more under Veterans Affairs and maybe less about directly D&D and the CAF, but do you ultimately believe that if we were to try and provide far more programming, far more opportunities for veterans, to exit out into the private sector or after service employment? Are we doing a good enough job in terms of that as the Government of Canada? Should we be focusing more on veterans' pensions? What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you very much for the question. This is, I think, entirely speculative, a bit of a speculative question. I will speak as an individual who is at 34 years of service, so clearly much closer to retirement than to my recruitment. And so obviously it's something that's near and dear to my heart. And I think it's really important from our perspective to be able to offer employment and opportunities to our former Canadian Forces members. I'm not going to speak to the services Veterans Affairs offers because at present I'm thankfully not in receipt of those services. But our country is one that offers, I believe, respects greatly the service of our members. And we are certainly in a better position today in terms of services offered to our members, but by Veterans Affairs. And I would suggest that we could always benefit from increased services, but everybody will always ask for more. I think there's lots of opportunities for employment and any assistance that we can get in terms of offering employment to our veterans is certainly well received from those both in uniform and those who previously wore the uniform. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. In terms of how we move forward with what potential military information or skills information has been linked or divulged, is there a future consideration in terms of our future procurement and the contracts? I think of the F-35, for example, and as it relates to the pilots that we need to be in consideration of as we negotiate that final contract.
So thank you for the information, for the question, sorry. I think we're constantly looking at the policies that we have in place and updating those policies to ensure that we do have best practices in concert with other federal departments, but also with our allies to ensure that we do protect that information. The F-35 is one that obviously we're interested in finding out whether or not we will acquire the F-35 for the Canadian Forces. We do have a number of allied partners who are already operators of those aircraft, and there are specific security considerations around those aircraft that will speak to and will contribute to strengthening of certain policies or examining our policies to see are there gaps anywhere that need to be filled in terms of ensuring that we can protect that information as best possible.
Thank you, Ms. Mass. And we're about to embark on the second round. Colleagues, I just remind you the motion that was adopted was the committee takes an undertaking to study into reports that former RCAF pilots have undertaken employment to train members of the People's Liberation Army Air Force. We are wandering a fair bit afield here, but I'm not going to call relevance, but it is a narrow casting of a study. With that, 5 minutes to Ms. Shelley Cramp Newman.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Brigadier General Boucher. My first question, can you speak to the 50% reduction in experienced fighter pilots that we've had since 2015?
I'm afraid I cannot speak to that at all. It's certainly outside of my area of expertise, and that's probably the first time I personally have heard that number.
Fair enough. So I guess with regards to your earlier testimony, my concern is that we can't have it both ways. Is on the one hand, I understand that you're taking this issue seriously, but on the other hand, you're referring to the Department of Justice for investigations. So it seems as though it's a double-edged sword. So if you can just speak to that.
Certainly, thanks for the question. The challenge that we have in this space is obviously these are retired Canadian Armed Forces members. So we take our security obligations incredibly seriously within defense, and obviously that is my role in terms of reinforcing the security program, training, awareness, obligations of members under the Secrecy or Security of Information Act. These are things that are important to us. We need to consider how we can best protect our obligations to ensure the defense of Canada and the security of our members. When members retire from the Canadian Armed Forces, they become civilians, as any other Canadian civilian, and they fall under the jurisdiction of those federal partners. This being said, if those federal partners decide that they want to investigate any allegations that are out there, and they would come to us to find out any information that could assist them with their investigation, we will of course work with those federal partners to ensure that they can best investigate and inform their investigation and determine what next steps would be taken.
Okay, thank you. My next question is, can you confirm, are you aware that the Canadian Armed Forces have court-martialed retired generals out in the past?
Thank you for the question. I am not personally aware of that at all. No, it definitely does not fall within my purview, so I'm not aware of that.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Considering the clearly obvious personnel catastrophe that we have in the military right now, do you understand or believe that the DND has the resources to monitor the threats that we're speaking about at this committee right now?
So thanks for the question. It's a bit of a speculative one. We don't monitor retired members per se. That is not the purview of the Canadian Forces. We do not watch over Canadian citizens. It's not our purview to do so. Collection of information on Canadian citizens is not our purview. So from my perspective as a DGDS, I'm responsible for ensuring we have a security program in place to protect our information, protect our members, and protect Canada.
Perfect, thank you. I'm going to split my time with Mr. Bazin. Thank you.
Thank you. No more a minute. Okay, so just the name of the company that is training the Chinese pilots that allegedly have Canadians also training Chinese pilots from the People's Liberation Army Air Force. It's called the Test Flying Academy of South Africa, and they actually say in a statement they've put out that they highlight that its training is also available from other civilian contractors, including organizations based in the United States, Canada, and European jurisdictions. Knowing that they are training pilots from the People's Liberation Army Air Force, knowing that there's the story of Canadians providing that training, would you be aware of which Canadian organization would be subcontracted to provide that training to the Test Flying Academy of South Africa?
So thank you for the question. I am not aware of the name of any Canadian company that would be potentially providing that training. It's certainly not within my my area of expertise, and as an Army officer, I'm certainly
General,
not aware of those
you did say that you
opportunities.
have responsibility for the enforcement under the National Defense Act of the sections that apply to the security of information and the making sure that members that are currently serving, and it applies to those that formerly have served, to honor those commitments, to ensure that their classifications and the information they know isn't shared with adversaries.
Very briefly, please.
Yeah, so thank you. I did indicate that I have responsibilities with regards to that. I do have responsibilities with regards to that for serving members. As members retire, they are just Canadian citizens, and we don't have any jurisdiction within national defense over those members. That jurisdiction then falls to our federal partners, and it is up to them to do so. But your question related to a specific Canadian company, I don't know that company at all, and you asked if I did, and I do not.
Thank you, Mr. Bazin. Madame Lambropoulos, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank General Boucher for being with us today to answer some of our questions. I know that a lot of it is quite repetitive. There's only so much you can say, and there's only, so much that is in place that the Armed Forces has jurisdiction over, from what I understand, in terms of retired soldiers. So I guess one of my questions is if you can maybe, of course, loyalty plays a really big role here. The fact that it's each person's responsibility really to make sure that they don't divulge information that was protected information. Can you tell us a little bit about the process that exists to educate CAF members about their obligations? And like both during and after their service, is it known to them that once they retire, this is not supposed to be, something that they do. Of course, it should be common sense, but is there a specific process in place? And can you speak to that?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I can absolutely speak to that. What I can tell you is that throughout a member's service, so right from the start of their basic training, we start to inculcate those values that are important to Canadian society, but important to the Canadian Armed Forces, so our values and ethics. We speak to integrity and security, security of information, and that which we deal with. And it's a bit of a lifelong or a career-long effort to continue to reinforce those values, reinforce our obligations under security as members gradually work their way through different areas of responsibility as they're afforded security clearances and the opportunity to treat and handle information that may be classified to different levels. Members are informed of their obligations under the Security of Information Act. They're reminded of that as we renew security clearances periodically over time, depending on the kind of clearance. They last a certain number of years. As those security clearances are updated or upgraded, again, we have opportunities to disclose their obligations under the Security of Information Act. And again, as I mentioned earlier, when members release, we actually have them fill out a specific form that allows them to acknowledge their obligations in the Security of Information Act as they do retire. That's the final reminder before they become Canadian citizens that they must protect this information because it's important for the security of our members of the Canadian Forces, but also the security of Canada.
That's right. And so because it's so important to the security of Canada, of course, do you think, and I'm not sure if you're able to give us your own opinions on such things, but is there anything that you see, given that you know the system quite well, that could be improved in order to make sure that the allegations that we're hearing of don't happen in the future? And is there, I understand that, the jurisdiction ends once they retire, and that then you work with your federal partners, including the Justice Department, but what else do you think could be done after the fact, once they've retired, to ensure that the information is protected and that,
Okay, thank you for the question. I think throughout our careers, we have this obviously repeated to us. This is a great thing about military training is you never get it only once. You tend to get it multiple times throughout your career. And these are the kinds of things that we're trying to ensure that we have in terms of values. Loyalty is obviously a critical value for the Canadian Forces. We regularly have professional development sessions or different courses throughout your career, throughout the different ranks that will reinforce those values that we hold dear. Those values are informed by Canadian society. They're the values that we ascribe to as members of the Canadian Armed Forces. And security of information is one of those things that obviously we take very seriously. But from my perspective, I mean, you're asking for a bit of an opinion. I'm a member of the Canadian Force and have been for 34 years. It is the kind of thing that has been effectively repeated to me for those 34 years. I'm a proud Canadian citizen, and obviously I would not want to do anything that would potentially harm Canada and our citizens. We're incredibly fortunate to live in this country. And I'd like to think that those messages that we continue to push onto our members as we discuss and we have opportunities to exchange with regards to those values and our obligations, that we bring that sense of belonging, that vocation, that loyalty is drilled in so that members would never want to, even outside of uniform, potentially harm Canada. This being said, our policies and our procedures, our training are all in place, and we constantly look to update those things to ensure we keep repeating those messages. And so these are the kinds of things that, based on these allegations, we will probably continue to repeat those messages to ensure that those members understand those obligations.
Okay, we have to leave it there. 2.5 minutes. Ms. Normandy.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Once again, General Boucher, you mentioned that Defense cooperates with various authorities who look after the investigation. I'd like to know if the reverse is true. When it comes to protecting our current pilots, let me give you an example. That's something that springs to mind here. Could the investigators communicate to you any information on pilots who do training and say, for instance, they were with the forces from this year to that year, they worked on this or that type of aircraft, they know the strengths and weaknesses of those aircraft, so that current pilots can be protected, because then we'd know the Chinese have this information, and then you could adjust accordingly and make any changes to strategies to protect those who are currently in the armed forces. Is that the kind of cooperation you get? Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. Look, to my mind, these are allegations. I don't know what the investigation will bring about, what information we'll get, whether we'll get that kind of detail. That's the kind of information that, yes, indeed, we would use and find out once we know the names of these members, what their experience was, could we protect information if we know there's risk to our pilots. We're always worried about the security of our members, not just our members, but the information too, and our organization, and the National Defence and the Canadian Forces. That's narrow cooperation, of course, between federal partners in order to protect the security of Canadians. Thank you. I don't know if I have any time for another question, but without getting precise details on the nature of pilot training, who may be training Chinese pilots, has there been any action taken by DND to protect current pilots? Thank you for the question. Yes, indeed. We don't know much right now about the allegations. It's a preliminary investigation right now, but having said that, the protection of our members is something that's primordial. The safety, security of our members is something for which we always take measures. Our measures are already very good when it comes to the safety and security of our members. We check the security of information they have on hand and their knowledge, and we ensure their loyalty.
Madam Masson, 2.5 minutes.
Looking at maybe a larger picture on this, do you believe that we're doing enough to combat the right-wing radicalization of some former military members? Of course, we heard, unfortunately, that there was potentially some links between former military members and the convoy that attacked Ottawa this past winter. Do you think that the government needs to focus more on preventing a lot of that radicalization?
We are really straying from the motion and the reason that General Boucher was invited here. You are inviting him into a realm of speculation that is very interesting. I'd be interested in his answer, but I'm feeling that is a bit beyond. The way I'm going to leave it, General Boucher, is you're invited to answer, but I would understand if you declined.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would have to agree with your comment. It's definitely a speculative answer, and that I would have to give it. It's nowhere near where I should be straying at this point. I believe that it's not within my purview to answer that.
Go ahead.
That was my only question then.
That was your only question? Okay. We're final to Ms. Gallant, 5 minutes.
General, on what date did you refer the news story to your security partners for investigation?
Thank you for the question. I'm afraid I don't actually know what date that would have been referred to security partners. That's not within the purview of my responsibilities as Director General for Defense Security.
Would you please follow up with the date that it was referred to this committee, please? Have any of the security agencies come to the Defense Department for more information?
So thank you. Yes, we'll refer we will return to you with the date. Absolutely. I can't speak to what agencies have currently contacted us at present, if that's the question. I'm not sure when that would have taken place. That's not within my purview per se. But I know that we have been in contact.
Okay, would you kindly provide us with the answer to the question as to which of the security agencies have come for more information to the Defense Department? Who is the lead agency on this investigation?
Thank you for the question. The lead agency, I'm not sure who the lead agency is on the investigation. It certainly falls within the purview of the Department of Justice. And again, I'm not aware of who would be the lead investigator for that.
So is it the RCMP or is it CSIS? Who is investigating this? Which agency?
I'm afraid it would be speculation on my part to actually say who it would be. I would assume that it would be the RCMP, but I do not know that for certain. It's certainly outside of my area of expertise.
We know that soldiers have trained members of the PRC on base Petawawa in Arctic warfare. Has our Air Force participated in any exercises with PRC pilots presently?
Thank you for the question.
Pilots present at the exercises.
Thanks for the question. I'm not aware of whether or not we've had pilots present during those exercises. In fact, I was not aware necessarily that we'd had Arctic training with them before this week.
Would you find out the answer to that question, please, and provide it to the committee? In October of 2019, members of the CAF participated in the World Military Games in Wuhan. Did any members of the Air Force compete?
Thanks for the question. I do not know if any members of the Air Force. I would assume probably because the Canadian Armed Forces send a team, but I do not know for certain. But we can certainly check and confirm that.
What safeguards would have been put in place to ensure that our competitors in that games event were shielded from incursions into the information, the electronics that our military would be carrying to those games?
So at this point, thank you for the question. That would be a bit of speculation on my part because I don't know what the actual measures would have been that were taken. I would expect that the measures would have been briefings on the intelligence concerns around being in the People's Republic of China.
General, I'm wondering what was done to shield them from actual incursions from the PRC, given that they were at one of their camps.
Right. So as I was trying to say, the briefings will normally take place that will inform them with regards to their obligations to protect their information. If they're actually, for the most part, when we actually travel to China, even as a member that is maybe on leave, if you're going there as a tourist, you tend to be discouraged from bringing your electronic devices just because of the potential risk that is there. I've even seen that in open source media that members should be careful when they bring their telephone to China. So that would have taken place, but there wouldn't necessarily have been any specific shielding. It would be an informative sessions. There wouldn't necessarily have been members bringing any of their work communications devices. It would have only been personal communications devices, but there would have been security briefings to that effect.
Employees from other departments are subject to the National Security, the Official Secrets Act for life. Are there any members or any ranks of the Canadian Armed Forces that are also subject to the terms of the Official Secrets Act for life?
So thank you for the question. The Security of Information Act, the provisions of the Security of Information Act continue. Your obligations of the Security of Information Act continue as a military member even in retirement. It's just a matter of the jurisdiction thereof after the fact. So all members of the Canadian Forces are subject to the Security of Information Act, and we remain subject to the provisions of the Security of Information Act even in retirement. But again, our jurisdiction as a Canadian Armed Forces ends with retirement.
Thank you, Ms. Gallant. Mr. Fisher, final 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much, General. General, you talked about loyalty built over decades. You spoke about your 34 years, and I could hear the pride in your voice, and I want to thank you for your service. I want to also say that I think me, certainly, and Canadians, I think, have an absolute trust in our Canadian Armed Forces. And I think that there's a real, I suspect that follows through to Canadian veterans as well. We talked about, we used the word speculative a lot today. We don't know of an individual. We don't know if this is actually happening. We know we saw it in a report, and this committee takes it seriously because there's a report out there, but we really don't know. We don't have those answers. And I appreciate you being here today to you're kind of thrown in front of the wolves because you don't have the answers to a media report that has not been proven or not. With respect to Ms. Matheson's question about radicalization, I actually do think it's relevant. I think why else would a Canadian veteran, if it even occurred, consider training a Chinese pilot with Canadian intelligence? So I do actually think it's relevant, and I want to know if the Canadian Armed Forces is looking at radicalization within its members.
If I've said that Ms. Matheson's question is not relevant and it is a realm of speculation for Ms. Matheson, it is similarly a speculation for Mr. Fisher, although I think his phrasing might have been a little bit more elegant. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would you like me to take a crack at that, or just deny the ability to answer that one as well?
That's why you're the Brigadier General. You get to decide.
Outstanding, Mr. Chair. Thank you. So what I can tell you is that inside of defense has always been the case that we are always looking at in terms of security of Canadian Forces members and Canadian society at large. That is our role, is to defend Canadian citizens in Canada. So any concerns with regards to radicalization are of concern. There have been obviously media reports out there that speaks to the potential for members that have been radicalized inside, but you are all also aware of the certainly the significant efforts inside of defense to ensure that we do root out any potential for concerns around this space as we try to ensure that we espouse the values of the Canadian Forces to the greatest extent possible.
For the final, how much time do I have left, Mr. Chair?
2 minutes.
So with my final time, General, thank you for that answer. Could you, and I know that these questions are all sort of touching on the same topics, and you're phrasing your responses a little bit differently for each of us, but can you just elaborate for our committee on procedures that are in place to protect sensitive CAF information?
Certainly. Thank you for the question. So in terms of procedures, we have a number of policies in place with regards to all manner of security, whether that be industrial security, physical security, personnel security, and security of information technology, information management. All of those come into play. And depending on the type of information that you're dealing with or the type of security in particular you're dealing with, there's different measures that are in place. Training is primordial here. It's about ensuring people understand the sensitivity of the information or the equipment that they're dealing with, their obligations under the Security of Information Act, because in the end, regardless of the type of security that we're dealing with, it has to do with information. As members leave the Canadian Forces, they don't leave with the hard copies of information that are out there. So it's really what resides within their memory banks in terms of internal memory banks, if you will, with regards to how they do that. So in ensuring that we do train them appropriately with regards to how sensitive it is to protect the information, that's where we go in terms of protecting that information. And then we remind them of those obligations throughout their career. And then at the very last days of their career, as they actually retire, they have an obligation to fill out these disclosure forms that reminds them of their obligations under the Security of Information Act. I'm not sure if that answers your questions.
It provides a level of comfort.
I'm sorry, it was cut off there. I didn't hear that.
Oh, that provides us with a little bit of comfort on this committee. I want to thank you again for your 30 years of service and your loyalty to the Canadian Armed Forces. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher, and I want to thank General Boucher for, I see a waving hand from Mr. Bazan. So before I ask General Boucher to leave, Mr. Bazan.
Mr. Chair, based upon today's testimony and also information that's been coming to light today, including from the Sunday Guardian, which is suggesting that there are also Canadian companies in Canada training fighter pilots from the People's Liberation Army, I'd like to move the following motion that in our current study of former Royal Canadian Air Force pilots have undertaken employment to train members of the People's Liberation Army Air Force, that we invite CanLink Aviation, who operate Moncton Flight College, and other flight schools in Canada who may be training pilots from the People's Liberation Army to appear at committee.
Okay. The motion, in my judgment, is properly on the floor. It relates to the subject matter that is on the floor. We are, however, running out of time. I'll recognize Ms. Normandine.
Vous me voyez venir, je vais...
You can see me coming. I'd like to have a copy of the motion in French first, please.
Missed what you said.
I was saying simply that I'd like a copy of this motion in French, please.
S'il vous plaît.
As we know by the rules, Mr. Chair, that we can move motions during committee if they are relevant to the subject matter at hand, which I have done. It's not a written motion, it's an oral motion, and I would hope that interpretation would have caught it.
Yeah. And yes, Mr. May.
Thank you. I appreciate the motion that's been brought forward. However, and I'm sure most of us have not seen the information that maybe Mr. Bazan has. It's hard for me to vote on a motion based on information that we just haven't had a chance to review. I'm wondering if maybe we can discuss this, in a committee business situation.
I'm running up against the clock here, and so the motion is properly before us. It is a debatable motion. It doesn't have to be in both official languages at this point because it's not a written motion. Having said that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn. I know, but we can. Yeah.
I'm more than happy to defer debate on this until the next committee meeting.
Okay, fine. We're good with that. With that, again, I want to thank General Boucher for this unusual hour, and appreciate your contribution to the committee's study. With that, colleagues, we are adjourned, and.